There is a plaque at the bottom of Patricia Lake in Alberta, Canada. You cannot see it from the surface. You need scuba gear and about 15 meters of depth. Divers who have made the descent describe the experience as quiet. The water is clear, the light filters down in long, cold columns, and the plaque is small, a bronze rectangle in grey silt, unremarkable from above. It was placed there in 1989 by the Alberta Diving Council. The text on it reads, in part, "This marks the remains of a vessel constructed of pykrete, a mixture of ice and sawdust built by the British Admiralty as a prototype for a proposed aircraft carrier. Most people who kayak across this lake in summer, and it is a beautiful lake inside Jasper National Park, the kind of place that appears in outdoor magazines, have no idea that a warship is beneath them. Most people who know about the plaque have no idea what it actually marks, or why it is there, or what was lost when the project it commemorates was cancelled. The project was called Habakkuk. The material it used was called pykrete. The man behind both of them was Geoffrey Pyke. That is what this story is about. Story is. Here is what the plaque does not explain, because a bronze plate in a lake cannot hold enough words. In 1942, at the lowest point of the Second World War, a British scientist convinced Winston Churchill to build an aircraft carrier. Not a small one. The largest vessel in human history. 600 meters long, 90 meters wide, capable of carrying 150 aircraft. Its walls would be 12 meters thick. It would weigh 2.2 million tons, 26 times heavier than the Queen Elizabeth. The Titanic, for comparison, was 269 meters. This ship would have been more than twice as long. It could self-repair battle damage overnight. It would be nearly impossible to sink. It would be nearly impossible to burn. And it would be built almost entirely from ice. Churchill signed the approval memo in December 1942, classified most secret. A prototype was constructed in Canada by a team that included a future Nobel laureate and a camp of pacifist conscientious objectors. It worked. And then, as these things sometimes go, the man who invented it was destroyed along with his invention. The project was cancelled and the world moved on and forgot both of them. Before we explain any of that, we need to be in a room. Quebec City, Canada, August 19th, 1943. The first floor of the Chateau Frontenac, one of the grandest hotels in North America, commandeered for the duration of the Allied Strategic Conference, codenamed Quadrant. In this room are some of the most powerful men in the Western world. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General George Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, Admiral Ernest King, dozens of senior aides and attachés. The meeting has been running hot. Britain and America disagree again about the timing of the invasion of France. Tempers are tight. And then Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, asks the room for a moment's attention. Two junior officers wheel in a cart. On the cart are two large blocks of something. One looks like ordinary ice, pale, slightly cloudy, sweating in the August heat of the room. The other looks almost identical, but carries a faint greyish-brown tint, as if something has been introduced into the freeze. Mountbatten explains briefly that he is about to demonstrate a new British military material. He says it is stronger than concrete. He says no vessel made from it can be sunk. He says it does not burn. Then he reaches into his uniform and produces a service revolver. The room goes quiet. He levels the weapon at the first block, the ordinary ice, and fires. The block shatters. Fragments of ice scatter across the floor and bounce off the shoes of generals who have commanded armies and are not accustomed to being sprayed with debris indoors. Several men flinch. Witnesses later describe the crack as substantially louder than expected, startling even to men accustomed to the sound of weapons fire. Mountbatten says calmly, "There, that is ordinary ice. Now I shall fire at the block on the right to show the difference." He takes aim at the second block, the greyish one. He pulls the trigger. What happens next is recorded in Alan Brooke's personal diary, and it reads exactly as strange as it sounds. The bullet strikes the surface, does not penetrate, and rebounds at a sharp angle. It travels across the room at what witnesses describe as considerable speed. Not a fragment, not a bounce, but a full velocity ricochet. Grazes Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke in the leg, the most senior military officer in the British Army, and buries itself in the wall of the Chateau Frontenac, where, for all anyone knows, it remains today. The room erupts. Generals and admirals who have survived combat are checking their trousers for punctures. Someone asks whether Brooke requires a doctor. Brooke, who is unhurt but clearly surprised, says he does not. Brooke later described the bullet as having buzzed round our legs like an angry bee, a phrase that will appear in every history of this project ever written. The chaos settles in approximately 30 seconds. In the silence that follows, Mountbatten says his line, the one that will be quoted for the next 80 years. This is what we came here to discuss, and the meeting, improbably, continues. Both things are true. A bullet has just grazed the chief of the Imperial General Staff, and the meeting continues. This tells you something about the room and something about the war. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why a British admiral fired a pistol at ice in front of the Allied High Command, and why the room went silent instead of laughing, you need to understand 1942. And to understand 1942, you need to understand what was happening in the North Atlantic and how badly things were going. In 1942, the German U-boat fleet was winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Not gradually, not technically, they were winning decisively. Between January and November of that year, German submarines sank over 1,000 Allied merchant ships. That number is not a rounding error. 1,000 ships carrying food, fuel, ammunition, aviation gasoline, medical supplies, aircraft parts, tanks, everything Britain needed to stay alive, everything the future invasion of Europe would require. The losses were so catastrophic that some senior British planners privately questioned whether the country could sustain the war. Churchill later wrote that the only thing that truly frightened him throughout the entire conflict was the U-boat campaign. He did not write this lightly. The specific problem was geographical, and it was elegant in the way that problems are elegant when they seem designed to be unsolvable. Allied aircraft, flying from bases in Britain, Canada, and Iceland, could provide air cover for convoys for a certain distance. Ships that sailed beyond that range entered a zone, stretching across the mid-Atlantic, roughly 700 miles wide at its worst, where there was nothing above them. No aircraft, no protection from the air. U-boat commanders who located a convoy in this zone were, for periods of hours or days, operating in conditions close to impunity. The convoys had surface escorts, but surface escorts without air cover were losing. The zone had a name. The Allies called it the Black Gap. The Germans called it Paradise. The obvious solution was aircraft. The less obvious problem was that there was nowhere to put them. The North Atlantic is not dotted with islands at convenient intervals. The distance from Iceland to Newfoundland is over 2,000 kilometers. Land-based aircraft of the era could not cover that gap. Carrier-based aircraft could, but fleet carriers were among the most valuable and contested assets in the entire Allied inventory. They were needed in the Pacific, where Japan was fighting for naval supremacy across an ocean. They were needed in the Mediterranean. The idea of committing irreplaceable fleet carriers to convoy escort in the North Atlantic was, in the strategic calculus of 1942, essentially unthinkable. Escort carriers existed, smaller, cheaper, purpose-built vessels. But in early 1942, American shipyards had not built enough of them. Steel was rationed. Aluminum was rationed. The raw materials needed to build conventional ships were themselves under severe pressure, partly because so many ships had already been sunk. Britain was caught in a loop that military planners find particularly demoralizing. The tool needed to solve the problem was the same tool the problem was consuming. More ships were being sunk than could be built. Something different was needed, something that did not require steel, something that could be built from what the Allies actually had. Into this situation, in September 1942, Geoffrey Pyke sent his memo. And Geoffrey Pyke is why this story is worth telling. Britain was caught in a loop with no exit, and the loop was tightening with every ship that went down. If you've ever wanted to know what it actually takes to convince Winston Churchill to build a warship out of frozen water, stick around, because the answer starts with one man, and it is considerably stranger than anything you've heard so far. The man's name was Geoffrey Pyke. He was not a naval architect. He was not an admiral. He had never designed a ship in his life. If this story is the kind of thing you want more of, the like button and the subscribe are right there. It matters more than it looks. Now, Geoffrey Nathaniel Pyke was born in London in 1893. His father, a Jewish lawyer, died when Geoffrey was 5 years old, leaving the family without money. His mother sent him to Wellington College, a school populated almost entirely by the sons of army officers, where Pyke showed up in Orthodox Jewish dress and maintained his religious customs in an environment that had no idea what to do with him. He was, by most accounts, miserable there. He was also clearly extraordinary. At Cambridge, he read law. What he actually did was think ceaselessly about problems that other people had decided were solved or unsolvable, stripping each down to its assumptions and finding the one that didn't hold. He had a habit of reasoning his way to places that seemed insane until they didn't. In 1914, 20 years old and restless, Pyke decided to go to Germany as a war correspondent. Not after the fighting started, during it. He obtained a forged American passport, entered through Denmark, made it to Berlin, and lasted 6 days before being arrested and sent to Ruhleben, a civilian internment camp outside the city that the Germans described as escape-proof. Most of the inmates accepted this. Pyke began collecting data. He interviewed other prisoners about their failed escape attempts, mapped the common failure points, and built a statistical model of what actually went wrong and why. Then he and a fellow prisoner, Edward Falk, made a plan based on the data. In the spring of 1915, they walked out of Ruhleben, crossed Germany on foot and by train, reached neutral Holland, and arrived back in Britain. The escape made headlines. Pyke wrote a book about it that sold well. MI5 read both the book and the intelligence reports and immediately put Pyke on a list of people whose activities required explanation. He was 21 years old. They would keep that file open for the next 33 years, until the year he died. He did not become a spy, or at least almost certainly did not. What he became, in sequence, was a best-selling author, a commodities speculator who briefly made a fortune on the London Metal Exchange, the founder of a progressive experimental school, a bankrupt and eventually a recluse, living on donations from friends. By the late 1930s, he was producing long memos about problems nobody had asked him to solve, suffering periodic severe depressions, and occupying the uncomfortable position of being recognizably brilliant in a way that no institution knew how to use. One scientist who encountered him described Pyke as not a scientist, but a man of vivid and uncontrollable imagination. This was not entirely meant as a compliment. It was, however, accurate. What saved Pyke, professionally at least, was Lord Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, was exactly the kind of man who could see past the beard, the unconventional lifestyle, and the hundreds of pages of seemingly unhinged proposals and identify what was underneath. Pyke was brought onto the Combined Operations staff and immediately began producing extraordinary, unsettling, occasionally brilliant suggestions. Most were rejected. Some were implemented. One of them led to the development of the M29 Weasel, a tracked vehicle for snow operations that became one of the standard American light utility vehicles of the war. But it was from America, where Pyke was working on the Weasel project, that he sent the memo that changed everything. In September 1942, Geoffrey Pyke composed 232 pages and sent them to Mountbatten. Mountbatten later said he was sold within the first 12. The proposal was this: build floating islands in the mid-Atlantic. Not natural icebergs. Pyke had worked out precisely why those wouldn't function. Natural icebergs float 90% below the surface. They roll without warning. They can't be steered. But constructed ice, built from the bottom up, shaped like a ship, fitted with refrigeration and engines and a flight deck, was a different proposition. The mathematics worked. Ice floats. Ice can be shaped. Ice can be repaired with more ice. The North Atlantic contains, in winter, essentially unlimited quantities of frozen water. The question was not whether ice could be built into a vessel. The question was whether ice could be made strong enough to survive the North Atlantic, to absorb torpedo impacts, to carry the weight of aircraft landing at speed. The question was material, and the answer came from Max Perutz. If you haven't heard of Max Perutz, you have probably benefited from his work anyway. He was a Viennese-born molecular biologist who would win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1962 for determining the structure of hemoglobin. In 1942, he was working for Combined Operations, and his prior research had focused on glaciers, specifically on how the crystalline structure of ice changed when foreign materials were introduced. When Pyke's memo arrived, Perutz had a relevant observation. Pure ice was structurally weak. It shattered. It cracked under variable load. It melted at rates that made it impractical for anything requiring persistence. But ice that had been mixed with wood pulp before freezing behaved fundamentally differently. Perutz began his experiments in a cold store beneath the Smithfield meat market in central London, working behind a screen of hanging animal carcasses to maintain secrecy. The choice of location was characteristic of the whole project. Hidden in plain sight, improbable at every level, conducted by brilliant people in the most unlikely circumstances, and producing results that nobody outside the project would have believed. What he found exceeded every estimate. The mixture was 85% water and 15% wood pulp, the cheap, abundant byproduct of the paper industry. Frozen together, the resulting material was stronger than concrete. You could fire a standard bullet at it from close range, and the bullet would not penetrate. It melted approximately 5 times more slowly than ordinary ice. It floated. It could be machined like wood and cast like metal. You could shape it with the same tools used for timber construction. It was susceptible to a saw blade, oddly, in a way it was not susceptible to bullets. Apply force suddenly, a bullet, a hammer blow, a torpedo, and it absorbed and deflected. Apply force slowly and persistently, and it could be cut. Perutz named it Pykrete, after Geoffrey Pyke. It is still named after him. This is, at present, one of the 2 things in the world that bears Pyke's name. Here is the thing about Pykrete that the technical reports don't quite capture. The material had a quality that felt, to everyone who encountered it, slightly wrong. You could see that it was ice, the color, the translucency, the surface texture. You expected it to behave like ice. It did not behave like ice. Mountbatten first demonstrated it to Churchill by dropping a block into the Prime Minister's bathtub while Churchill was in it. Churchill had been soaking. He stayed for some time. The Pykrete block was still substantially intact when he got out. The outer layer melted away to reveal fresh wood fiber that insulated the remainder. Churchill, who found this delightful, approved the project on December 4, 1942, in a memo classified most secret. The project was given the code name Habakkuk, a deliberate misspelling of the Hebrew prophet who wrote, "Be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told." Churchill's specifications for the full Habakkuk were extraordinary. A vessel 2,000 feet long, longer than 6 aircraft carriers placed end to end, nearly twice the length of the Titanic, 300 feet wide, walls of Pykrete 40 feet thick, designed to absorb torpedo hits, a draft of 150 feet, a refrigeration system running through the entire structure, diesel-electric engines providing a top speed of 7 knots, capacity for 150 to 200 aircraft, total displacement 2.2 million tons. The Queen Elizabeth, at the time one of the largest ships ever built, displaced 83,600 tons. HMS Habakkuk would have been 26 times heavier than the largest passenger liner in history, It would have been the biggest thing humanity had ever floated. And neither the American Navy nor the British Royal Navy wanted anything to do with building it. The Americans found the project peculiar. The British naval establishment found it worse than peculiar. The Royal Navy had priorities, real ships, real battles, real losses to replace, and could not spare engineers, administrators, or enthusiasm for an experimental ice carrier that remained, in their view, a theoretical exercise. So the project was assigned to Canada. The National Research Council of Canada, under C.J. Mackenzie, who wrote privately that the whole idea was another of those mad, wild schemes, was given responsibility for constructing a proof-of-concept prototype. The site chosen was Patricia Lake, inside Jasper National Park in Alberta for its cold winters, reliable ice, and a nearby railway line that could bring in materials. The workforce assigned to build it was in a detail that feels almost designed for symbolic effect. A camp of conscientious objectors, men who had refused combat on moral grounds but had agreed to serve in non-military capacities. They worked through the Canadian winter in temperatures well below freezing, laying Pykrete blocks one by one on the surface of the frozen lake. Britain's most audacious warship was built, quietly and without ceremony, by men who wouldn't carry a weapon. If you are wondering at this point whether any of this is actually true, that is the correct response. Through the winter of 1942 and 1943, those objectors laid Pykrete blocks on the frozen surface of Patricia Lake. Not the full Habakkuk, the complete vessel was beyond the capacity of a Canadian national park in wartime. A proof of concept, 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, weighing approximately 1,000 tons. The cooling system was deliberately minimal, a single 1-horsepower electric motor circulating cold air through the structure to test whether Pykrete could maintain itself on relatively modest refrigeration at Canadian ambient temperatures. The structure rose slowly from the lake through the winter months. Workers who were building it describe, in the accounts that survive, the particular quality of pride and bewilderment that comes from being asked to construct something that shouldn't exist. By spring 1943, the prototype was complete. It floated. The Pykrete held structural integrity through the warming months in a way that pure ice would not have. The 1-horsepower motor kept it stable as the Canadian spring arrived and temperatures climbed above freezing. Engineers ran tests, filed reports, measured strength and melting rates and structural behavior under variable load. The properties Perutz had identified in the Smithfield cold store translated at 1,000-ton scale into something that demonstrably worked. They had built a ship out of ice, and the ship was still there. There were engineering complications. Some piping arrived damaged and had to be replaced. The behavior of Pykrete under the specific load dynamics of aircraft landing required more characterization. But these were engineering complications. The fundamental concept was sound. Perutz had been right. Pyke had been right. The thing worked. It was against this background, a working prototype, a signed Churchill memo, real data, that Mountbatten walked into the Quebec Conference in August 1943 and asked for a moment of the room's attention. Now, the Quebec demonstration and what the record shows almost minute by minute. The 2 blocks have been transported to the Chateau Frontenac, packed in dry ice in thermos flasks. By the time they are unloaded and set up at the far end of the meeting room, the ordinary ice block has sweated through its packing. The Pykrete block is unchanged. Mountbatten's formal presentation, engineering specifications, prototype data, strategic case has not gone well. The generals are polite but distant. Alan Brooke is visibly unimpressed. Mountbatten reaches the end of his prepared material. The room is drifting. He's been watching this happen. He has an idea. At approximately 4 p.m., with the meeting losing momentum, he reaches into his uniform and produces his service revolver. He does not ask permission. He announces that he will further demonstrate the indestructibility of Pykrete through direct experiment. The room, which had been drifting toward the exits in spirit if not in body, goes completely still. Aides stop moving. Generals who have survived combat experience the particular alertness that comes from being indoors with a man holding a drawn weapon. Mountbatten faces the ice block. Behind him, the assembled Allied command arranges itself without quite deciding to. He fires at the ordinary ice block. It shatters with a crack that is much louder than anyone expected. Fragments scatter across the floor. Several men flinch. A few take a step back. Mountbatten says, into the ringing silence, "There, that is ordinary ice. Now I shall fire at the block on the right to show the difference." He takes aim at the Pykrete. He fires. The bullet strikes. It does not penetrate. It rebounds at speed and crosses the room, grazing Brooke in the leg, or the shoulder, accounts differ, before burying itself in the wall. The room is silent for a full second before anyone processes what has just happened. The chaos that follows lasts approximately 30 seconds. Generals are checking themselves for injuries. Aides are asking questions simultaneously. Brooke, who is unhurt, establishes this fact and is quiet. The bullet is in the wall of a hotel. Mountbatten holsters his weapon. The silence in the room is, by all accounts, absolute. He says, "This is what we came here to discuss." The meeting continues. By early evening, both Churchill and Roosevelt have been informally briefed on Habakkuk, and both have expressed support. The Canadian prototype data has been formally presented to Allied planners. The full-scale design, Habakkuk 2, the definitive vessel, is under active development. For approximately 6 weeks, it appears that Britain might actually build a 2.2 million-ton aircraft carrier out of ice. Then, the engineering reports arrived. The first problem was steel. This is where the ironies begin to accumulate. The refrigeration system required to keep Habakkuk frozen, brine-filled pipes running through the full length of 40-foot thick Pykrete walls, maintaining temperature across a vessel 600 meters long in the North Atlantic, required a very large quantity of steel tubing. Engineers calculated the total. Then, they compared it to what would be needed to build a conventional steel aircraft carrier of equivalent operational capacity. The refrigeration system alone for Habakkuk required more steel than the entire hull of a conventional carrier. The material that was supposed to replace steel, because steel was in short supply, required more steel to maintain than the thing it was replacing. This is the kind of finding that kills projects. The second problem was wood pulp. The full Habakkuk required approximately 300,000 tons of wood pulp to produce sufficient quantities of Pykrete. Britain's paper industry ran on wood pulp. Canada's paper industry ran on wood pulp. Diverting that quantity from existing production would create measurable disruptions in the manufacture of paper, at a time when maps, military orders, government communications, and supply manifests were running the war. The material required to build the unsinkable carrier would make it significantly harder to administer the war while building it. The engineers noted this, without irony. The irony was there, waiting to be noticed. The third problem was that the crisis Habakkuk had been designed to solve was resolving itself through other means. Portugal had agreed to allow British use of airfields in the Azores, extending Allied air cover into the eastern edge of the Black Gap. American shipyards were producing escort carriers fast enough that a new one was launching roughly every 2 weeks by mid-1943. Long-range variants of the Liberator bomber were extending patrol ranges. The U-boat kill rate was rising sharply. The month of May 1943 alone saw 41 U-boats destroyed, a rate that the German Navy could not sustain. The strategic emergency that had made Habakkuk feel urgent in 1942 was not gone, but it was receding. By the time the Quebec Conference took place, the Battle of the Atlantic had already turned. Habakkuk was a solution that had arrived after the problem began to solve itself. In December 1943, the final meeting of the Habakkuk board was held. The official conclusion was recorded in the careful, colorless language that governments use to bury things they once believed in. The large Habakkuk 2 made of Pykrete has been found to be impractical because of the enormous production resources required and technical difficulties involved. Max Perutz, writing about the project years later from the perspective of a Nobel laureate who found the entire episode slightly embarrassing, was more precise. The US Navy's evaluation noted that the steel required for the refrigeration plant exceeded the steel needed to build the carrier from steel. The false prophet had been found out. Not because ice couldn't be made strong enough, but because the infrastructure to keep it frozen was more expensive than the thing it was keeping frozen. Mountbatten withdrew his support quietly, moved on to other campaigns, and said little more about Pykrete. He had other things to do. There would be many. He is remembered today for the Viceroyalty of India, for the fleet, for a long and celebrated public life ended by an IRA bomb in 1979. The moment he shot Alan Brooke with a ricocheted bullet is, at best, a footnote. Geoffrey Pyke did not get the chance to move on. By the time Habakkuk was cancelled, he was no longer working for combined operations at all. The MI5 file on Geoffrey Pyke had been accumulating since 1915. The Ruhleben escape had attracted their attention first. Too clean, too methodical, too successful for an amateur in a camp described as escape-proof. His left-wing politics through the 1930s had kept their interest. The connections, some tangential and some less so, to people British intelligence regarded as Soviet sympathizers had added pages. During the war, with Pyke embedded in combined operations and working on material that touched some of Britain's most sensitive programs, the file grew considerably. MI5 gave him a code name, Professor P. They believed he was a senior official in the Soviet Comintern, operating undercover in Britain. They opened his letters. They followed him through the bombed streets of London. They never proved anything that would hold up as evidence. But they had enough to make life difficult. After Habakkuk was cancelled in December 1943, Pyke was placed on reduced pay. He objected, loudly, persistently, in the way he objected to everything he found unjust, which was most things. His objections were noted and ignored. Then he was informed that his services were no longer required. He refused to accept this and continued arriving at the offices of Combined Operations, sitting at his desk and attempting to work. The response, in the end, was unambiguous. He was removed from the building by armed guards. The man who had conceived Pykrete, who had written the 232-page memo that launched the project, whose material had been named after him and demonstrated at the highest level of Allied command, was physically expelled from his own workplace at gunpoint. No ceremony, no recognition, a guard on each arm, out the door. The post-war years were quiet and diminishing. Pyke continued producing ideas for international cooperation, for conflict prevention, for educational reform. Most were ignored. The Times ran a profile that called him brilliant and unrecognized. MI5 continued to watch. On the evening of February 21st, 1948, Pyke shaved his beard, consumed a bottleful of sleeping pills in his room in Hampstead, and died. His landlady found him the following Monday morning. He was 54 years old. The coroner returned a verdict of suicide at a moment of mental unbalance. Private letters he had written beforehand suggested the act was premeditated. 3 years later, in 1951, papers discovered in the flat of Cambridge spy guy Burgess, who had defected to Moscow, contained material connected to Pyke. The subsequent investigation was inconclusive. The matter was never resolved. Pyke did not live to see it. The obituary in the Times began. The death of Geoffrey Pyke removes one of the most original, if unrecognized figures of the present century. It praised his intelligence and his willingness to take ideas seriously that others found absurd. It lamented that most of his life had been one of frustration and disappointment. He had been described, more than once, as the kind of mind that appears once in a generation. He died in a rented room, watched by an intelligence service that had spent 30 years failing to prove its suspicions about him, expelled from the institution he had served, his most famous invention cancelled and classified. His name lives on in Pykrete. The material he built, or rather the material built in his name, from his idea, by conscientious objectors on a Canadian lake in the winter of 1943, outlasted him. The prototype survived the spring of 1944. It survived the summer. It survived 1945. The war ended, the project was classified, the records were sealed, and still the Pykrete structure on Patricia Lake did not fully melt. 3 complete Canadian summers, temperatures rising well above freezing, sun on the water, tourists in the park, and the structure held. Eventually, after 3 years, it dissolved. The metal components, pipes, brackets, the structural elements that had held the Pykrete hull together sank 15 meters to the lakebed as the ice around them gave way. They are still there. The Alberta Diving Council placed its plaque in 1989. The material Perutz had developed in a cold store behind animal carcasses, the material named for Pyke, the material that had ricocheted a bullet off a wall in the Chateau Frontenac, rested quietly in cold Canadian water and did not decompose. In 2009, the Mythbusters television program built a small boat from a modified version of Pykrete using newspaper pulp rather than wood, and successfully piloted it in Alaskan waters. It held. It traveled at 25 miles per hour. The team confirmed the properties: bulletproof, slower melting than ice, stronger than plain ice, capable of being shaped with conventional tools. They expressed doubt about whether a full-scale aircraft carrier could have survived the engineering realities of the North Atlantic, but they confirmed the fundamentals. 60 years after Perutz worked behind the Smithfield carcasses, the material still worked. The myth was not a myth. The false prophet had, it turned out, been telling the truth. What happened to Pykrete after the project was cancelled is not a story of vindication exactly. The material did not go on to revolutionize shipbuilding or change military doctrine. It remained a curiosity, something real that had been proposed, tested, and set aside. Max Perutz went on to win the Nobel Prize and became one of the great figures of 20th century science. He occasionally mentioned Pykrete in interviews briefly, with the slightly embarrassed air of a brilliant man discussing something that did not quite fit his legacy. He died in 2002 at 88, celebrated for hemoglobin. The Pykrete was a footnote. Alan Brooke, the man who took the ricochet, survived the war and died in 1963, honored as one of the architects of Allied victory. His diary, published after his death, is the most quoted source in every account of the Quebec demonstration. The biblical verse that gave the project its name, deliberately misspelled by Pyke or by his Canadian secretary, the sources disagree, reads in full, "Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told." Habakkuk the prophet was writing about disaster, about a punishment coming that the people would not accept as possible until it arrived. The verse is not a boast. It is a warning about the limits of belief in the face of what is actually going to happen. Whether Pyke understood this layer of the quotation when he chose it is not recorded. He was not, by most accounts, a religious man. His childhood Judaism had been something imposed on him, a source of isolation rather than comfort. But he had spent his entire adult life proposing things that people would not believe, even when told. He had watched those things be proved right and then suppressed. He had watched other people receive credit for versions of his ideas. He had died in obscurity while the world used what he had built under other names. The verse fit, whether or not he chose it for that reason. There is a plaque at the bottom of Patricia Lake, 50 feet down, in water cold enough to preserve it well past anyone's lifetime. Divers describe the light there as good in summer, long columns filtering down through clear water, the lakebed visible in detail. The plaque is a small bronze rectangle in grey silt, easy to miss if you don't know where to look. It marks the remains of a vessel built by pacifists and a future Nobel laureate in the winter of 1943. Designed by a man who was called a genius in his obituary and removed from his desk by armed guards. The prototype is still there, 50 feet down on the lakebed. Geoffrey Pyke is not. The ice eventually melted. The man did not get the luxury of melting slowly. He was extinguished all at once in a rented room in North London in February 1948, 3 years after the war that he had helped to fight was over. Called a genius in the obituaries, unknown to the public, watched to the end by an intelligence service that never proved what it suspected and never stopped suspecting. The material named after him outlasted him. In cold, clear water, it always does.